Hello everybody, and today I'm going to be talking about the main ideas of Dr. Jack Kruse, MD. So Dr. Jack Kruse is a neurosurgeon. I believe he's been practicing for about 30 years, but on top of that, he is basically the godfather of modern quantum biology, and he has put out a lot of content, made a lot of videos, written a ton of blogs over the past 20 years, and obviously the information can be very in-depth and very hard to understand. So I want to go over some of his information today. So just as a quick background, I just graduated from medical school as a doctor of naturopathic medicine as well as a doctor of chiropractic medicine. And I have been studying Dr. Kruse's work for about 2.5 years and quantum biology essentially for about 6 years, give or take. So these are the main ideas of Dr. Kruse, at least in my interpretation. And so what I've done is I've put them into two tiers. And so you can see the first tier and the second tier, and we're just going to go over the first tier today. In my opinion, about 80% of everything he talks about can be put into the 5 bullet points in tier 1. And especially within tier 1, the first 2 topics there are really, I just went through some more of his blogs, and I really think that if you understand those first 2 topics there, you can understand most of what he says, especially if you understand the first 5. And so we're going to be going over that today. So the first 2 topics we're going to be going over, which are, in my opinion, are really the 2 big topics that Dr. Kruse talks about, is that we essentially have 2 healing/regeneration programs in our body. The first is Becker's DC electric current, and the second is mitochondrial mitophagy and mitogenesis, which relies on good circadian biology. That's the primary factor for regulating mitochondrial health and getting the regeneration that is supposed to be occurring at night. And so we're going to talk about Becker's DC electric current first. So let's talk about Dr. Robert Becker's DC electric current. So Dr. Robert Becker was an orthopedic surgeon and researcher, and specifically he performed some pioneering work on regeneration, and specifically within that he focused on bone regeneration. And here's a main summary of his finding that's relevant to what we're talking about today in Dr. Kruse's work. So he found that bone doesn't heal, it regenerates. And I want to stop for a second and explain the difference. So when something heals, for instance, if you had surgery on your leg, when it heals, there's scar tissue that forms over. So the tissue isn't the same perfect healthy skin tissue that was originally there. It's scar tissue that forms. That's healing. Regeneration is when there's no scar and the tissue reforms basically perfectly as if it were brand new healthy tissue that had never gotten injured. That's regeneration. And Dr. Becker found that bone doesn't heal, it regenerates, and it does so via a DC electric current, which is actually created in the nerve that innervates the injured tissue. And that DC electric current then travels right under the myelin sheath and stimulates the periosteum. Then what happens is that the red blood cells, which are then stimulated by the DC electric current, undergo dedifferentiation and effectively turn into stem cells. And then these new stem cells are able to redifferentiate into new healthy bone tissue. And so basically from his work, it appears then that the signal for healing and regeneration in the human body is the DC electric current. And that is why Dr. Kruse talks about Dr. Becker's work so much, because this is such a critical piece, obviously, once you understand it. So continuing with Dr. Becker and specifically the Kruse-Becker connection. So what's interesting is, so Dr. Kruse read Dr. Becker's work and actually then went and visited him eventually and hypothesized to him that the DC electric current that Becker found is actually created via sunlight hitting POMC, causing the cleavage of melanin, and then UV light hitting melanin, which charge separates the water in the cell and creates free electrons, which then creates the DC electric current, which is transmitted down the nerve through the free electrons being transmitted basically via semiconduction and creating an electrical current. So this is why Dr. Kruse talks about Becker so much, and not only that, but why he talks about POMC so much, because POMC, he believes, is involved in creating this electric current, which is the healing and regenerative signal in the body. So then we can see that basically, to sum all of that up, based on Becker and Kruse's combined work, what it appears then that causes healing and regeneration. And they found this not just in humans, but in all animals and in all tissues, is that a DC electric current, which is created via sunlight's interaction with POMC and melanin, creates a boatload of free electrons, which are then moved via semiconduction down the nerve to create the DC electric current, which then hits the periosteum of the bone, de-differentiates the red blood cells into stem cells, and then those differentiate into the needed cells and regenerates the tissue. So that is the story of Becker and his DC electric current and POMC and melanin. Now, POMC and melanin also have some other different functions. They're really incredible, diverse. POMC is a gene and melanin is a molecule, respectively. But that's the main story, and that's the main thing that Kruse talks about by far, because this story with the Becker's DC electric current is just so critical for healing and regeneration in all organisms. The second thing that's really critical for healing and regeneration in all organisms, and is really the other big thing that Dr. Kruse talks about and links a lot of other things to, is circadian biology, and specifically the effect of circadian biology on mitochondrial function. And so this story, I think, is actually much simpler than the other story. And really, the basics of it is that essentially there's a time to be creating energy and mobilizing cortisol into the bloodstream, which mobilizes glucose and fatty acid in the bloodstream to be burned for fuel and to be up and active and doing things. And there's a time for rest. And when it's a time for rest, it's a time for regeneration, cellular cleanup, turning down cortisol, turning up melanin and mobilizing it into the bloodstream, and doing all of the things that it does, and basically running the cleaning and regeneration program. And essentially the problem is that when cortisol levels are not peaking at the right time in the morning and waking them up and giving them energy, so people will then have low energy during the daytime, but they'll also have higher cortisol at nighttime when they're not regulating their circadian rhythm properly. And this is a huge problem, obviously, in our modern society because of the tech addiction and the use of blue lit screens at night, which is obviously one of the big things that Dr. Kruse talks about. And again, the reason it's a problem because when you're doing this, you're disrupting your circadian rhythm and you're disrupting the nighttime program, the melatonin program, which is the time when the mitochondria are supposed to be basically regenerating. And as I will talk about, mitochondrial function is basically, and mitochondrial dysfunction is basically the root cause of all aging and disease. So most of what he talks about really does come back to these two main ideas. The first being Becker's DC electric current and how it interacts with POMC and melanin to cause regeneration in all organisms. And the second being circadian rhythm and how important it is for the health and regeneration of our mitochondria. Most of what he talks about really comes back to those two ideas. And he talks about a lot of stuff, but what he does is he talks about a lot of different topics and then links them back to how they affect these two topics mainly. Also the other three that make up the 5 total that we'll get to, but really mainly comes down to these two topics. And I want to give you some examples of how he links so many different topics back to those two primary topics that we just went over. So the first being, why does he talk about avoiding blue light exposure at night so much? Well, it disrupts the circadian rhythm, body doesn't know it's night, and then you can't get into the regeneration phase for the mitochondria at night, so the mitochondria don't undergo mitophagy and repair, and as I've talked about before and we'll talk about again, mitochondrial damage is the root cause of basically all chronic disease. So it's like, why does he talk about avoiding chronic artificial blue light exposure even during the day? And the reason for that is because it damages melanopsin and other chromophores. Then you can't, your body, so that suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, through the eye, it can't tell what light is in the environment. So when it can't see that the blue light is gone, it doesn't know how to, it can't regulate its circadian rhythm. So then you come back to the same thing, circadian rhythm dysregulation, mitochondrial dysfunction and degeneration, which leads to chronic disease. Why does Dr. Kruse talk about non-native EMF and 5G so much? Well, Dr. Becker showed in his experiments that non-native electromagnetic fields disrupt the DC electric current that he found. That is the basic concept, and I think that's a really important one to highlight because he talks about a lot of different things that if you don't understand that connection right there will really leave you wondering what he's talking about. But when you understand that connection right there, it really helps clarify a lot of things. And then lastly, why is sunlight so important? Well, sunlight's important for a lot of reasons, but the two basically main points that he makes is that the morning sunlight sets the circadian rhythm, so it controls basically all hormone release and the timing of all physiological processes, as well as when our mitochondria actually regenerate at nighttime, which I've talked about several times now. But then the daytime sunlight is also necessary for causing that POMC cleavage to produce melanin so that you can actually create Becker's DC electric current in your nerves, in the neurons, to actually regenerate and heal tissues to keep you healthy. And again, I talked about how Dr. Kruse's piece to that was his hypothesis that POMC cleavage to melanin via sunlight and light hitting it is actually what creates Becker's DC electric current in the nerve, because Dr. Becker never actually found what the origin was of that current in the nerve. But Dr. Kruse has stated that he went to visit Dr. Becker, and Dr. Becker, and he told Dr. Becker his theory, his hypothesis on this, and Dr. Becker was like, "Oh, I can't believe I didn't see that, but that has to be it." So that's really the two crucial pieces that a lot of his stuff comes back to. And if you can really wrap your head around these two ideas and how he links so many things back to them, I think it'll help clarify a lot of the things that he talks about. So the third of the 5 topics that I think are the really main points of the things that Dr. Kruse talks about is that essentially all chronic disease is due to mitochondrial dysfunction. And I actually already did a video on this. It was my first YouTube video, actually. You can see the link right there. So if you want to go into great depth on that, you can just go ahead and click that link. Dr. Doug Wallace and Dr. Nick Lane are the two main guys that both Dr. Kruse and I really respect and have read a ton of work on, and really have gotten a lot of ideas from, and I think they're both ahead of the field. And Dr. Thomas Seyfried has done some really good work with cancer as well that I've read, and that certainly deserves credit as well. So that's the third big topic, that just understanding essentially in one word sentence that essentially all chronic disease is due to mitochondrial dysfunction. And so anything that disrupts mitochondrial dysfunction significantly, aka circadian biology, is something that we really want to avoid. So on to the fourth topic here, the leptin melanocortin pathway. So this was actually Dr. Kruse's original work of art, so to speak. So he essentially discovered the great importance of this pathway and popularized it. He didn't actually discover the pathway. These PhD researchers who do the actual lab research discovered it. But he's really been almost solely responsible for actually popularizing its importance. And so essentially, it appears that the hormone leptin is sensitive to both circadian rhythm regulation and also sunlight itself. And there's no question that leptin is sensitive to circadian regulation. That's been very clearly discussed in the literature. And so essentially leptin levels can be affected by circadian rhythm dysregulation, and that actually leads to leptin resistance and its downstream effects, mainly being obesity. So essentially, the circadian rhythm dysregulation leads to leptin level dysregulation and leptin resistance, which then causes obesity. Now, the second point is a little more controversial, but so Dr. Kruse talks about how all these different molecules, all these really different important molecules, including the neurotransmitters and hormones and different things, many of them actually have absorption and emission spectrums within the action spectra of light. And so it appears that the actual molecule, leptin itself, is a photon trap, and that it actually absorbs a certain spectrum of wavelengths of light, which I believe is affecting its signaling abilities. And so essentially what you can see then there would be that when you are not absorbing sunlight through the eyes, it can possibly be affecting leptin's ability to affect its functions through when it binds to the receptor in the brain. Specifically, leptin binds to the hypothalamus and regulates appetite levels. And so what's interesting is that Dr. Kruse has stated that not only does sunlight hit photoreceptors in the eye, which then the signal is transduced through nerves that go to different parts of the brain, but in addition to that, sunlight itself is actually being directly tunneled into the human brain via these Mueller cells, which are literally fiber optic cables and have been described in the literature there as being such. And so the takeaway is that being properly circadian regulated, as well as having proper sunlight exposure, specifically through the eye, is critically important to energy balance and obesity. And that's just a factor that virtually no one is talking about with regards to that topic, and which is why it's so interesting to follow Dr. Kruse's work and see some of the cutting edge things that he talks about. And so, as we'll see, those two variables are also absolutely critical to just about every other physiological process, that being circadian rhythm regulation and proper sunlight exposure, daytime sunlight exposure specifically, and the prevention of almost all chronic disease processes. So we are now on to the last of the 5 topics for the main things that Dr. Kruse talks about. And so the last topic is non-native EMFs. However, so blue light is also technically a non-native EMF, but it really deserves a little bit of its own subcategory. So I split them both up into 2 subcategories, and so we're going to talk about blue light first here. So chronic artificial blue light exposure during the day is harmful for 2 main reasons. The first is that it disrupts the electron change transport in the mitochondria, which is the process that it essentially makes ATP. So you stop mitochondrial production of ATP. And then secondly, it destroys the melanopsin photoreceptors, which I actually already talked about a little bit earlier, which leads to a damaging cascade, which I'm about to go over. So this is something that Dr. Kruse talks a lot about and is really important to understand. So not only is chronic artificial blue light exposure at nighttime harmful because it disrupts the circadian rhythm, which disrupts our mitochondria's ability to heal and regenerate and stay healthy, and also disrupts the hormonal regulation, so then all our hormones are off. But chronic artificial blue light exposure during the daytime is also bad. And the reason for that is what we're going to talk about here. So melanopsin is a blue light chromophore, which is found in the skin, in the subcutaneous fat, eyes, arteries, and brain. And it's a critical light detector for circadian rhythm regulation. And so what happens is chronic blue light exposure, especially without red, infrared, and possibly also UVA light, damages the melanopsin photoreceptors. This then doesn't allow the regeneration of those photoreceptors, as Dr. Kruse talks about this law as well, that infrared A light regenerates all photoreceptors, which is part of why daytime sunlight is absolutely critical. So the damaging of these melanopsin photoreceptors has multiple negative effects. So not only does it specifically damage the melanopsin receptors, preventing you from detecting blue light, therefore preventing you from being able to tell time and the proper circadian rhythm exposure. So again, we're back to the chronic artificial blue light during the daytime. Not only during the nighttime, but during the daytime, it actually damages these melanopsin receptors. Therefore, you can't detect blue light. Therefore, you can't detect when the sun's going down. That gives you circadian rhythm dysregulation, which affects both the hormone regulation negatively and your mitochondria's ability to regenerate. But then additionally to that, blue light damages the melanopsin receptor. It releases vitamin A in its toxic form called the aldehyde form. And this is actually toxic to other photoreceptors as well as cell membranes and other cellular structures. So it actually causes additional cell damage when you receive this chronic blue light exposure, and it actually damages the melanopsin receptors. So there's a lot of damage that can be caused when you're getting this chronic artificial blue light exposure, even during the daytime and especially at nighttime. But that's why really at both times we really want to avoid this chronic artificial blue light exposure. So therefore, as you can see, chronic artificial blue light exposure causes a cascade of negative, far-reaching health effects, especially when it's not countered by its opposite, which is the red and infrared, and possibly also the UVA light, which is not being received. And so you can see the situation that most people are in currently, where not only are they under chronic artificial blue light exposure, both at daytime and nighttime, but they're also not getting the antidote to it, which is the red and infrared and possibly also UVA light, which is present during sunlight during the day, because they're always inside and not outside. So you can see how this really damaging cascade can begin and just doesn't get stopped and just continues to get worse because of the lifestyle that most people lead. So we are now on the last of the 5 main topics that Dr. Kruse talks about, which is non-native EMFs, which stands for non-native electromagnetic fields. And so this really is a long, complicated topic, which I could definitely do a weekend seminar over because of the complexity of the topic and just the amount of information and detail in it. However, It is possible to very succinctly break it down into just a couple short paragraphs here, and for you to be able to get the gist of it and the 80-20 of it. And so that's what we're going to do. And so basically the main concept here that you need to understand is that essentially the entire human body is completely dependent on electromagnetic signaling phenomena to run its physiology. So there's optical signaling going on, so these different tissues, and again, this comes back to the absorption and emission spectrum that it's been found that different molecules, the really important molecules in our body like neurotransmitters like dopamine, melatonin, etc. use, and then as well as the subcellular structures, and then the magnetic signaling that's happening in the body. And again, for this, you can see the recent research on European robins and free radical signaling. That actually goes to Jim L. Khalili's book, Life on the Edge, to the electrical signaling that's happening in the body. Again, one great example of that is Becker's DC electric current. Another thing is different ion channels, so voltage-gated ion channels that you might have heard of. Those rely on electrical signaling. And then even some things rely on quantum mechanical processes in our body. And in fact, a lot of things rely on it. There's quantum entanglement of particles and molecules. There's different subcellular structures and even possibly cells use quantum resonance. There's quantum superposition in enzymes and DNA. And this also goes back to Jim L. Khalili's book, Life on the Edge. Fantastic book, highly recommend. He's a theoretical physicist, and this is completely mainstream verified science, although it's certainly cutting edge science. But so essentially, and there's actually another book that Dr. Kruse I know is aware of by Roland Van Wyck. It's called Light and Shaping Life. And so in that book, it talks in great detail about how the entire human body really runs on electromagnetic signaling. All the DNA, the mitochondria especially, even different molecules themselves are releasing and receiving different electromagnetic signals in different wavelengths, and they're actually using that to communicate with other parts of the cell and other cells to actually do signaling and run our physiology. And the way that they don't interrupt with each other is that different tissues and different molecules actually use different nanometer wavelengths. They use different wavelengths to communicate with each other. So it's literally the same as we can have all these different radio stations and they don't interrupt with each other because they're all on different wavelengths. Well, your cells and the molecules within them and the different subcellular structures like the mitochondria and DNA, they're doing the exact same thing. They're using different wavelengths to communicate with the other structures that they need to communicate with to send signals to actually run our physiology. And what happens is when we're surrounded by these non-native EMFs, they can disrupt the signals that are being sent within our cells. So for example, the voltage-gated calcium channels may not supposed to be firing right now, but if you're surrounded by electromagnetic fields, then they could be firing when they're not supposed to be, and that can lead to these excess free radicals called peroxynitrates. This mechanism has been very well documented. That's why it's giving this specifically as an example. But it can lead to these excess free radicals, which can damage the cell, damage the mitochondria, etc. And so that's a basic rundown of how non-native EMFs basically disturb the cell and cellular physiology and basically harm us, is that our entire body is running on electromagnetic signaling. And when we're in a world of an unbelievable amount of alien frequencies and signals around us, it disrupts the signaling within us. And Dr. Kruse talks all the time about the fidelity of signaling and the timing of different mechanisms, and how you want things to be turning on when they're supposed to be turning on and turn off when they're supposed to be turning off, and how you want the fidelity of the signals to be pristine. And what non-native EMFs do is disrupt the quality and the timing of the signals that are supposed to be running within our body. And that is the primary mechanism by which non-native EMFs harm us. And so if you can understand that, that's another big topic that Dr. Kruse talks about, and that is just important in quantum biology in general. So this is basically everything I just went over. I kind of got ahead of myself and just started talking about all of this stuff off the top of my head, but essentially, again, you can see that all these proteins and macromolecules have absorption and emission windows for electromagnetic frequencies. And when we are getting electromagnetic frequencies from the outside world, they disrupt the signaling within us. And so if you want to read more about that, you can just pause the video and read more about this here, but I just went over all of that information. So conclusion and takeaways, the quantum mitochondria. So we just went through a lot of pretty complex information, and obviously I know that just really Dr. Kruse's information and the entire quantum biology field can be quite confusing to understand. And I hope I did a good job. Let me know in the comments if I did okay with that, and any questions you guys have and future topics you want me to cover. But so we just went over a lot of complex information regarding quantum biology and different mechanisms. So what are the practical takeaways that we can walk away with and try to implement in our lives? So the first is good circadian hygiene. So it is absolutely critical for both regeneration of and the health of our mitochondria, which is basically the determining factor in health, aging, and disease. It's also important for hormonal regulation, which is critically important. And it's also just important to go with that for energy even during the day, as well as the sleep at night, because if you're not regulating the cortisol release, then you're not going to have energy during the day either. So good circadian hygiene is really important. The second part is wisely dosed daytime sunlight exposure. So it's really not enough to just be getting that morning sunlight exposure. So the morning sunlight exposure, say you're getting your 15 minutes a day, that's going to regulate your circadian rhythm and your hormonal release and all of these cycles that go on in the brain, these diurnal cycles that are regulated by our environmental cues that go to our brain and are summed up by our brain, specifically the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the hypothalamus, and then the signals are sent to all the peripheral tissues. But it is also very important for daytime sunlight exposure. And there's many reasons that daytime sunlight exposure is important, and I did not go over all of them. Maybe I'll have to do a future video on that. But the main thing that Dr. Kruse talks about, and that's really important, is that POMC cleavage, basically you need sunlight through both the eyes and the skin to get POMC cleavage to stimulate melanin production, so that you can have this DC electric current that Dr. Becker found is so critical. And that's basically the game. And those two first bullet points are really a lot of what he talks about. And if you understand that, you're going to be in pretty good shape for understanding a lot of the quantum biology and a lot of the stuff that Dr. Kruse talks about, in my opinion. So the other thing is grounding. So again, we are surrounded by a lot of electromagnetic fields, and I could maybe have to go in a great length in a future video on grounding, because there's a lot to say there. But just being out in nature, being in connected to the earth, and kind of being away from technology is essentially a very good thing for our health. And then lastly, just don't abuse tech. So try to avoid excessive screen time, trying to avoid being around excessive technology and non-native electromagnetic fields. And then when you are, use protection. So for example, my screen is completely orange and red. I use an app called f.lux, and so I use that protection. There's also grounding mats. I'm sitting on my feet are on a grounding mat right now. But then ultimately, really what you want to do again is spend time outside in nature, in the sun, healthy, personalized dose of sunlight exposure that's appropriate to your skin type and where you're at. And then the grounding if you can, and then try to avoid excessive tech abuse and exposure to non-native EMFs. And then lastly, so this is a purely educational presentation. This is not medical advice. And then also, this is solely my interpretation of Dr. Jack Kruse's work. I have not had a chance to talk to Dr. Kruse, although I would love to be able to talk to him soon and hopefully try to get him on a podcast and be able to interview him. But this is solely my interpretation of studying Dr. Kruse's work, and what I have found are really 5 of his main key ideas, and then my interpretation of how to understand those key ideas. So thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and feel free to leave a comment if you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.